researcher, lecturer, and writer. It is Sunday, June 9th, 2019, and we are live. Hope everybody's doing well today. Share this broadcast on your Facebook page. Invite your friends to tune in also. We have a lot to talk about. So I saw articles dealing with this topic going back to March of 2019, an article by history.com, which is the official website of the History Channel. And then I saw one by the New York Times, actually going back to February 2016, first from the New York Times, read the New York Times every day, then one from the following month from history.com, official website of the History Channel. I get their emails on a daily basis. And then also one from AtlantaBlackStar.com, okay? So I wanted to talk about this. New research from an African-American female professor shows that white women made up about 40% of slave owners, about 40% of slave owners. And this is research coming from Professor Stephanie E. Jones-Rogers, who's an associate professor of history at the University of California, Berkeley. And she looked at census data from 1850 to 1860. Now, we know that when we deal with the history of slavery, which lasted basically 246 years in the British colonies, what then becomes the United States, we have different nuances as we go from the 1700s to the 1800s, 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s. So she specifically looked at Census Bureau data from 1850 to 1860. Okay, so this is what we're going to talk about. So everybody share this broadcast on your Facebook page. Invite your friends to tune in also. This is a real history lesson. I will also do a preview of the online course that we have starting up on June 12th, Wednesday, June 12th, Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, Understanding the Transatlantic Slave Trade, what they didn't teach you in school. This would be a 8-week, 16-hour online course that meets once a week, and we'll deal with thousands of years of history, and this will be live. This will be the first time I've done this course live in 2 years. All right, so let's look at the in African American business owners, post the name of your business here on the thread of the broadcast. Also, we'll let you know how you can advertise with the African History Network also, okay? All right, so let's look at the article from AtlantaBlackStar.com. AtlantaBlackStar.com has a really good article dealing with this topic. Research by Black female professor reveals startling truth that white women made up 40% of slave owners. Okay, research by Black female professor reveals startling truth that white women made up 40% of slave owners. Okay, and this article is from May 25th, 2019. So it's just a few weeks ago, May 25th, 2019. All right, so in this article, it talks about how a set of data uncovered by University of California, Berkeley professor reveals Southern white women played a heavier role in the enslavement of Africans than previously thought. Professor Stephanie E. Jones-Rogers, an associate professor of history at the university, combed through data from the 1850 and 1860 census and revealed that white women made up around 40% of slave owners, okay? So she has a new book that came out in February 2019, just in time for African American History Month. And the name of her book is They Were Her Property. They Were Her Property, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South. White women as slave owners in the American South, okay? So let me say from the outset that this is because of changes in social media platforms and because of new policies dealing with hate speech, and this is going to be on different social media platforms, this broadcast and the podcast, and it's going to be on 8 different podcast platforms. And because of certain backlash and attacks that have happened to me recently, let me say this from the outset. This is not hate speech. This is not about hating anybody. This is about understanding history and correcting the historical record. There's overwhelming evidence to document what we're talking about, okay? And we're not talking about hating anybody. And, you know, I teach this history, and also I'm an advocate of the history of African Americans being taught in school and the correct history of slavery being taught in school. And you hear me oftentimes talk about this study from the Southern Poverty Law Center called Teaching Hard History American Slavery. Teaching Hard History American Slavery. This is a 52-page study from the Southern Poverty Law Center. You can download it. Go to splcenter.org, splcenter.org, and it documents how the history of slavery is being incorrectly taught in American schools, not just schools that have predominantly African-American student body, but American schools, period, okay? It documents how the history is being incorrectly taught, the negative side effects from the history of slavery being incorrectly taught, and it gives tips and teaches how to more correctly teach the history of slavery. Okay, so I want people to understand that some of the information I say may go outside the circumference of some people's awareness. Just because you don't like it or disagree with it or never heard it before does not mean that it's not true. It just means you have to do some research to understand what it is that I'm talking about. All right, so let me say that from the start. Okay, so let's continue here. How's everybody doing? Toya and Daniel, Shirley, Anthony, just a few of the people watching. Okay, we'll post a link here also. You can register for the online course that I have starting up Wednesday, June 12th. And we'll do it live, and then it's archived after that. You can go back and watch it over and over again. We just posted the link. Also, it's at our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. The name of the online course is Ancient Kemet, the Moor, and the Ma'afa, Understanding the Transatlantic Slave Trade, where they didn't teach in the school 2019 edition. All right, let's continue here. All right, so the findings helped Professor Stephanie E. Jones compile her book entitled "They Were Her Property: White Women as Slave Owners in the American South." Now, on her department page at the University of California, Berkeley, Professor Stephanie Jones Rogers describes the February 2019 release of her book as, quote, a regional study that draws upon formerly enslaved people's testimony to dramatically reshape current understandings of white women's economic relationships to slavery, end quote. One of the things that her book did, the research of her book, one of the things that it did, and it ties into this 52-page study, Teaching Hard History of American Slavery, is that in addition to looking at census data, and in addition to looking at documents and letters, things like this, what are routinely looked at, she also looked at slave narratives or narratives of former slaves, okay? She looked at interviews done with former slaves in the 1930s from the WPA, Works Progress Administration, okay? And this was part of the New Deal, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s. And it was a specific department there called the Federal Writers Project. Okay, Works Progress Administration, WPA, of the 1930s. And this was part of the Federal Writers Project of the WPA. And one thing that they did was they interviewed former slaves and documented this, okay? If we look at this document, Teaching Hard History of American Slavery, on page, 16, I think it is, they talk page 10. On page 10, they show you this picture of this African-American woman who's a former slave, okay? I downloaded the study, took it to the printer, got it printed up, because this is what I do with a lot of studies. I do a lot of research, so I get the studies and get them printed up. But on page 10 of this study, it talks about how in the 1930s and 40s, the Works Progress Administration and Farm Security Administration photographed the daily lives of thousands of formerly enslaved people, tenant farmers, and sharecroppers. This photograph of a woman born in enslavement was taken in Greensboro, Alabama in 1941. Okay, so this is what we see here. This is from page 10 of this study that you can download as soon as you finish watching this broadcast, and we'll give you the link. We'll post a link here also. This is from Teaching Hard History, American Slavery from the Southern Poverty Law Center. So one thing that she did that went beyond a lot of other research is that she looked at firsthand accounts about slavery from formerly enslaved African people. Okay, so in her book, Professor Stephanie E. Jones Rogers explained that white women's involvement in slavery comes from family as their slave-owning parents, quote, typically gave their daughters more enslaved people than land, end quote, okay? Slave-owning parents typically gave their daughters more enslaved people than land. Now, she said, quote, what this means is that their very identities as white Southern women are tied to the actual or the possible ownership of people. She said in an interview with History.com, which is the official website of the History Channel. History.com has an article dealing with this from March 12, 2019. So this was probably the second article I saw on this topic. The first one I saw was from February 2019 by the New York Times. The second one was from History.com. I get their emails on a daily basis, then with This Day in History, and then also Inside History or History in the Headlines. I get that email as well. This article from History.com is entitled The Massive Overlooked Role of Female Slave Owners. The Massive Overlooked Role of Female Slave Owners. Okay, yeah, I kind of find it interesting that they didn't say white female slave owners, okay, in the title, but it's all right. I know what you mean. It's okay. When I look at the article from the New York Times, that article is entitled, it's a review of her book. That article is entitled White Women Were Avid Slave Owners, a New Book Shows. White Women Were Avid Slave Owners, a New Book Shows. So the article from History.com, I'm glad they wrote it. It's the History.com, once again, is the official website of the History Channel. But I just find it interesting in the title, they didn't say the overlooked role of white female slave owners, but it's all right. You got the information out there. I guess that's the most important thing, okay? And once again, this is not an attack on white women or anything like this. You know, when I teach this history, I try to be very fair in the history. You had white people who were abolitionists who risked their lives to free enslaved Africans. That is true. That's a true part of the history. White men and white women. You had some that were abolitionists. You had even more who were slave owners. And it's also important to understand that about at least this time in history that she's looking at, 1850, 1860, around this time, 75% of white people don't own slaves. So basically 25% of white people are the slave owners. That's true also. Okay. So when I do these types of presentations and these broadcasts, my lectures, my show, so people understand, maybe some people, this type of information is new to them. This is not a wholesale indictment of white people. This is not an attack on them. This is dealing with the history and correcting the historical record. This is what this is about. All right. Sandra, how you doing? Tommy as well. Okay. How's everybody doing? And then also, you know, I understand, and I've had people, parents who have biracial children who've approached me about getting information to teach their children. I understand that can be complex as well. Okay. If you are a white parent that has a biracial child, or an African-American parent that has a biracial child, how do we teach this history? Right. And at the same time, you don't want that biracial child to feel a certain way about their white parent. Right. That's that's something that I personally don't have to deal with, but I'm sensitive to other people who have to navigate that. I have them reach out to me for resources as well. OK. Toya said, we're not apologizing for our history. No, we're not apologizing for our history. But when I deal with this type of information, and especially because of certain changes in social media platforms based upon hate speech and certain things that have happened to me recently that I'm not going to go into, I have to frame this in a certain way. Okay, let's continue here. All right, so her book also notes that owning enslaved Africans served as white women's primary source of wealth. Plus, owning a large number of enslaved people reportedly made women better marriage material. All right. And this dealt with the accumulated wealth that some white women had who were slave owners. This made them a better catch. This made them a more suitable mate for a white man. All right. Now, once wed, okay, once she was married, white women were said to have fought and frequently won the right to continue to have ownership over their enslaved Africans, not handing over ownership to their husbands, right? Professor Jones Rogers says, quote, for them, slavery was their freedom, end quote. For them, slavery was their freedom. One example she gives is somebody who we know, who we've heard at least about, some of us know more about it than others, is Martha Washington, George Washington's wife. Martha Washington was a slave owner when they got married, and she owned more slaves than George Washington did. So after Martha Washington married President George Washington in Virginia in 1759, George Washington is said to have possibly owned around 18 people. Now, he became a slave owner at about 10 or 11 years old. He inherited some slaves from his father, all right? But his wife, one of the richest women in the state of Virginia, owned 84 enslaved Africans and dramatically increased the local slave population. So when they married, she owned 84 enslaved Africans. So she inherited basically her slaves, okay? And there was a story, there was a case about one of George Washington's runaway slaves. Her name was Ona Judge. I've talked about her in the past. AtlantaBlackStar.com and other sources have articles about Ona Judge, ONAJUDGE. And there's a good book called Never Caught, written by an African-American female historian who I met and talked to, and I can't remember her name. I'll pick it up. It wasn't Dr. Raina, Dr. Armstrong, Dr. Erica Armstrong Dunbar. That's who it is. Because I met the sister. She spoke at the Charles H. Wright Museum of African-American History. And I met the sister. I talked to her. We had a really good conversation. And I told her I was familiar with her work. And she also, let's see here. I'm going to try to pull up the article. That's a fascinating history dealing with Ona Judge. Ona Judge was the personal personal slave of Martha Washington. Ona Judge found out that Martha was going to give her away as a wedding gift to Martha Washington's niece or something like that, female relative, niece or something like that. So Ona Judge found out about this and she ran away. She goes up north. She runs away, and George Washington sent slave catchers after her a number of times, but she was never caught. This is where the title of the story, the title of the book comes from, Never Caught. All right. So, when oftentimes we talk about George Washington, we talk about the American Revolutionary War. We talk about him being one of the founding fathers, but his involvement in slavery and the enslavement of African people and the dehumanization of African people is oftentimes not talked about. Okay. So when we deal with this, history, it's a nuanced, complex history. He was, Dr. John Henrik Clarke probably put it the best. One of our great Grandmaster Scholar warriors, Dr. Clarke said, don't take George Washington out of the history, leave him in there, but you have to put Washington in the proper historical context, okay? The proper historical context. So the name of the book is called Never Caught, The Washingtons' Relentless Pursuit of Their Runaway Slave Ona Judge. Never Caught, The Washingtons' Relentless Pursuit of Their Runaway Slave Ona Judge by Dr. Erica Armstrong Dunbar. Okay, and this article right here is from AtlantaBlackStar.com. I think that's when I first found out about her. This article is from February 11th, 2017. And let me see, it was either there. Now, Roland Martin also interviewed her on TV1 when he had a show on TV1, News One Now. So I saw her there. And she also, let me see, if the Nat Turner movie came out in 2016, I first found out about her in the book that Nate Parker put out. That was a companion to the Nat Turner movie, Birth of a Nation. He put out a book about that also. So I have the book somewhere here with all these books here. And that sister wrote co-wrote a chapter in the book that deals with the history of the Nat Turner Rebellion. So let me see if I have a book here, because I have about 4 stacks of books here. So hold on, let me see. Just give me a second here, see if I can pull it out. This looks like Jenga. This is like African-centered Jenga or something. I'm trying to pull out the book that's towards the bottom of the stack without the whole stack falling. Let me see if I can find it. Oh, here we go. All right, here we go. So this book right here, if you saw the Nate Parker movie, Birth of a Nation, about the Nat Turner Rebellion, so I got this October 2016. So I probably first found out about her possibly from this book, because she co-wrote, Dr. Erica Armstrong Dunbar, she co-wrote the chapter in here dealing with history. And it gives a lot of background historical information about the Nat Turner Rebellion. That's probably hard to find. So the chapter she co-wrote it with another fantastic African-American female historian named Dr. Danny Ramey Berry. And okay. The chapter they wrote is called A History of Resistance, the Unbroken Chain of Enslaved African Resistance and Rebellion. A History of Resistance, the Unbroken Chain of Enslaved African Resistance and Rebellion. So if you get this book, or if you have it, it starts on page 35, okay? And they deal with a lot of the background history. And history I didn't know about the Nat Turner Rebellion. So when I did my lecture dealing with the history of the Nat Turner Rebellion of 1831, when the movie came out, there was some historical inaccuracies in the movie. The real history is different. So this was one of my sources for my lecture, dealing with the real history of the Nat Turner Rebellion and separating the movie, separating what we saw in the movie from the actual history. Okay, the name of this book is called The Birth of a Nation, Nat Turner and the Making of a Movement, edited by Nate Parker, the official movie tie-in. Okay, that's the name of this book. A lot of people don't even know this book exists. They went to go see the movie, don't even know this book exists. Okay, The Birth of a Nation, Nat Turner and the Making of a Movement, edited by Nate Parker, the official movie tie-in. So this is a crucial book. If you saw the movie, this is a crucial book. It also deals with behind the scenes, and it deals with the history of the making of the movie and what Nate Parker had to go through to get that movie made also. All right, so let's continue here. How's everybody doing? All right, and then we'll post a link here for the online course that starts up, that I'm teaching, that starts up Wednesday, June 9th. It's an 8-week, 16-hour online course, Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, Understanding the Transatlantic Slave Trade, what they didn't teach in school, 2019 edition. We're going to deal with thousands of years of history. It's going to be deep. All right, so let's go back to the article from AtlantaBlackStar.com. Research by Black female professor reveals startling truth that white women made up 40% of slave owners. All right. So when we're talking about Martha Washington, and we start talking about Ona Judge. All right. Professor Stephanie E. Jones Rogers argues that white women were trained to be engaged in the slavery industry at a young age. She said, quote, their exposure to the slave market is not something that begins in adulthood. It begins in their homes, when they're little girls, sometimes infants, when they're given enslaved people as gifts. And this happened. Okay. And when we look at Nat Turner had 3 owners in his lifetime. Now he died, he was executed November 11th, 1831. Okay. He was 31 years old. One of his slave owners was it was about 10 years old. It was a white boy about 10 years old who basically inherited Nat Turner. Okay. So you see this taking place in history. All right. So Professor Jones Rogers demonstrates that in her book. She demonstrates that in her book by including interviews with formerly enslaved people conducted in the 1930s through the New Deal Agency Works Progress Administration. All right. The WPA, Works Progress Administration. And that was the Federal Writers Project, which was like a department in the Works Progress Administration. One formerly enslaved said children would ruthlessly beat enslaved people. She said, quote, it didn't matter the child was large or small. They always beat you till the blood ran down. Or they always beat you till the blood ran down, she said. And let me see. I saw that quote. If we look at the article from history.com, they have that quote in here as well. It didn't matter whether the child was large or small. One woman told the WPA, they always beat you till the blood ran down. I think they went deeper into this in the article from the New York Times. Okay, on page 2 of the article from the New York Times entitled White Women Were Avid Slave Owners, a New Book Shows, from February 26, 2019, written by Parul Sehgal, Sehgal. On page 2 of this article, it says, from these stories, Jones Rogers, let me see, we have it here. I have it pulled up here on the screen also. So let's scroll down to this. From these stories, Jones Rogers brings an unseen world to life of white women's instruction in domination, a process of grooming that began in infancy. WPA interviewees, Works Progress Administration interviewees, recount threats, abuse, and whippings administered by white children. Quote, it didn't matter whether the child was large or small, one woman said. They always beat you till the blood ran down. And this also ties into, now at the same time, at this point, I understand that all white people at this point in time did not own slaves. That is true, okay? But when we talk about racism being a system of advantage and privilege distributed based upon race, because racism has nothing to do with not liking people, calling people racial epithets, things like this, right? And if you read Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGruy, she talks about this as well. If you read Powernomics by Dr. Claude Anderson, one of my teachers, or his first book, Black Labor, White Wealth, he deals with this as well. If you read some of my articles that I've written, I talk about this and deal with this in my lectures. Racism is a system of advantage and privilege distributed based upon race. Racism comes out of the ideology of European white supremacy, and this is designed to preserve white survival. Okay, this is a system. Racism occurs when one race of people control the majority of the wealth, power, and resources, benefits, privileges, land, access to education, access to opportunity, and they use this to marginalize, subordinate, and do harm to another race of people. Okay, now I'm not saying all white people are white supremacists, that all white people subscribe to this ideology, but we see it throughout history for the last 500 years. And what happens is when we talk about what was one of the most important things to understand about this is when we talk about racism being a system of advantage and privilege, then we have to ask ourselves, what is a system? Okay, a system is not a computer program. All right. When we talk about the system, right, we talk about the system's holding us down. A system is a group of people who have been indoctrinated with a certain ideology, and they work to keep that ideology, they work to uphold that ideology and enforce that ideology. That's what a system is. When we talk about racism being a system of advantage and privilege distributed based upon a race, then what are we actually talking about is the system. We're talking about a group of people who have been indoctrinated by a smaller group of people. We can call it the 1% or the 10%. They've been indoctrinated with a certain ideology, been convinced of it, and they work to uphold that ideology and keep it in place. Okay, so this is what we have to understand. And you know, I do a lot of research. I travel across the country. I do lectures. I read African American sources, white sources, things like this. Americans are woefully ignorant about history. African Americans and white Americans are woefully ignorant about history. The reason why is because there has been a concerted effort not to teach the correct history in our schools. So then those people who graduate from schools, American schools, if they don't get the correct history, they grow up to be adults who have children who are ignorant of history. So for instance, if we look at this study from the Southern Poverty Law Center, all this ties in together. And this is one of, now when I did the last time I did the online course, it was in September 2017. This study didn't exist because this study was first introduced in, was released basically February 2018 for African American history. So this didn't even exist. But one of the things this study did, Teaching Hard History, American Slavery from the Southern Poverty Law Center. One of the things it did was it did a survey of 1,000 high school seniors, 12th graders, 1,000 12th graders from across the country. And it asked them different questions about what they knew about the history of slavery based upon what they were taught in school. It found that only 8% of high school seniors surveyed out of 1,000